technique focus stacking, we can take images focused at different distances and incorporate them together to make one image with a hyper depth of field. Now, the first question you may be wondering is why not just shoot this at a small aperture? And here you can see with the image shot at f/22, the first problem is that we don't get the whole thing in focus. You can see the background is still a little blurry. And another thing which we'll look into a little more detail is because of a principle called diffraction, at very small apertures, nothing is quite sharp. So you can see here when we zoom in on this abalone shell, it all just kind of looks mushy. This thing doesn't have quite as much grit to it. You can see the teapot is even worse, and then of course the background isn't in focus. When photographing for focus stacking, it's crucial that your camera is mounted on a tripod. Any movement between shots will compromise your final output, so it's important. You can't really improvise by taping your camera or anything like that. Furthermore, just the act of pressing the shutter will move the camera if your tripod is either too light for the camera or on a less than perfect surface. So if you can use a cable or wireless shutter release, that is ideal. If you don't have a wireless shutter release, you can simply set your camera to self-timer for 2 seconds or 5 seconds or 10 seconds. So you press the shutter and take your hands off and wait for it to expose. If you are photographing outside, you'll find the challenge is doing this both carefully enough not to move the camera, but quickly enough that the sun doesn't move too much by the time you finish going through your sequence of shots. For your settings, you want to have your ISO in manual. In this case, I have it set to ISO 200. The specific ISO is not so important. I've picked ISO 200 to kind of have a low ISO to minimize noise, but as long as your ISO is the same through your shots, that should be fine. You can either have your camera set to manual or aperture priority, represented by an A on most cameras or AV on Canons. And on an APS-C camera like this, I will set the aperture to f8. If I were using a full frame camera, I would set the aperture to f11. While we are layering images together to create depth of field rather than using the aperture, it's still ideal to use a small enough aperture that we have a fair amount of overlap between our different focus points. The reason we use f8 and not f22 is really small apertures will create diffraction, which we'll be looking at in a moment. So in order to focus, it's best not to use the viewfinder. On a mirrorless camera, this may not apply, but on an SLR camera, it's best to place a point over your subject and then zoom in on that subject. This camera has a button called Focus Assist. Many cameras will just have a picture of a magnifying glass, and that way we can get a really crisp focus just on that subject. Now, for focus stacking, you want to photograph from front to back. If you photograph from back to front, you can reorder your layers, but it's easiest to go from front to back. So here's my first shot, and I will make the exposure. As I mentioned earlier, you want to use the aperture f8 typically on an APS-C camera or f11 when focus stacking on a full frame camera. And the reason for that is you want to maximize depth in each shot, but you also want to minimize diffraction. So here, if we look at this wall, I have some layers. This is f8, and if I go down to f11, there's a very subtle change. F16, the wall begins to get softer, and F22 it looks very soft. Now it might be hard to see this on video, so I will zoom in to 300%, and here we can see the bricks at 8, 11, 16, and 22, where it gets quite soft. So 22, 16, 11, 8. So between 8 and 11, the difference is subtle. 8 is optimal, but it seems like you can get away with 11. And on full frame, that rule also applies. So F11 is optimal, but you can get away with F16 a lot of the time. Your photographs, you can simply select the images that you plan to use for your stack in Lightroom. Any basic adjustments you want to make in Lightroom, you can go ahead and make. Then you can right-click, choose this option, Edit In, Open as Layers in Photoshop, and that will process that. If you don't like Lightroom and prefer to use Bridge, you can select the images and simply go to Tools, Photoshop, Load Files into Photoshop Layers. You can also, in both Lightroom and Bridge, go directly to Photo Merge in the Photoshop section and process these images directly into automatically stacked images, though you'll see in a minute that the automatically stacked images generally have problems. Once your layers are in Photoshop, the first thing you want to do is simply to highlight all the layers, which are in our stack right here, and go to the Edit menu and Auto Align Layers. And we'll just click OK. Now there is also an option for Auto Blend Layers, which has a Stack Images option. And I believe I have an example of that here. So here's the automatically stacked image, and it looks pretty good at a glance. But if we zoom in, we can see that the auto stacking makes pretty big mistakes. We got these big blurry blotches in here, just a big random blurry blotch on top of here. This tail is totally faded. A lot of this sort of nonsense here. So really, you're best off doing it by hand. Now, when approaching your selection by hand, one method is to go through each layer, select your object, and simply mask it. So if we look at the front and back layer, there we go, we have a masked lion statue in front of the wall behind it. Now, this method does sometimes work, but we have to remember that in the case of this image, some of our focus planes overlap. So I believe the tail of this statue is actually on the same plane as this abalone shell. We also have the table itself, which is going to move in sort of long, soft phases. So the way I'm going to go about stacking this image is to simply do it with the brush tool. This isn't the quickest way, nor is it the slowest way, but it does allow you to work very fluidly with the image. So to begin, I will leave the bottom layer alone. The second layer, I will create a mask on that layer, but I'm going to hold down Option or Alt on Windows and create a black mask. And I'll keep going up with that. And now I can only see my back layer. So just to review with masks, white is there, black is not. So if I quickly invert this mask, I can see that in the higher layer, the wall is not quite as sharp, but the teapot is starting to come into focus, and this wood right over here is looking pretty good. So now that we have our layers masked, we're simply going to paint detail in using the white brush on the mask. When we'll actually use the white and the black brush to sort of paint in and paint out as we go. If you remember one thing and one thing only, it's that you want to mask from back, being the wall, to front, being the statue, and also from the bottom layer to the top layer. A simple example of why this would be is if I were to be bringing in the detail, it's kind of magical when you get to brush that in, on this lion, but I've done it kind of loosely. Maybe so loosely that I've gone over this abalone shell here. Now if I go to the abalone shell layer, I can bring the abalone sharp, but not where the lion overlaps it. And if we look at just those two layers, we can see 1, 2, 3. So to avoid accidentally putting blurry material on top of sharp material, we work from the back and move slowly forward. So here I can see if I brush on the table, just get a little more clarity. I'm gonna make this brush a little smaller. The bracket keys allow you to quickly move the brush bigger and smaller. Another thing that can be handy is if you brush somewhere you don't mean to, you can quickly switch using the X key to switch from white and black to undo what you just brushed. Maybe you can see that better here. So I blurred that. I'm brushing back over to unblur it. So this layer in my stack seems to really just correspond to the table at this distance. Now it never hurts to move forward through your space. You don't want to move back through your space, but it doesn't hurt to move forward. And in fact, it can help because you can see that while this abalone shell is not particularly sharp compared to the other one, it is a little bit smaller. So even though this teapot doesn't quite come into focus on this layer, I'm going to carefully brush around the edges of it, because this will help me when I move to the next layer. So because we're working from back to front, I can scribble all over here, and that's just not going to matter because I'm going to go over it later. So really, you can see here, it looks quite crude when we zoom out. We've just brought in a little bit of detail on the floor. That's pretty much it. You can also use the backslash key, which will put up this red temporary mask, which shows me that I really probably should stay consistent all the way across this line. So I'm going to fill that in. Even if I'm not noticing the detail change, focus plane has shifted there. So now I'll move up, take backslash off, and on this layer we get to brush detail onto the teapot, and it really is just very satisfying to just brush things into focus. So when you're brushing on the inside of the object, as in not the edges, you can be pretty carefree with it. The edges are really where the work is. So here on the spout, I'm going to zoom in closely, and you can see if I just have a big wide brush and I brush right over the end of this spout, we've got great edge definition, but the wall behind it has become quite blurred. That's okay. We then flip to the back brush and we bring the wall back in. Now, you may think, why not just brush the whole thing in with one operation with the white brush and then switch the black to brush out? That may work for you. For me, I find it better to just keep working the edges in and out as I go, because it's easy to miss a spot when you go back if it's a while later. So here's an edge, I brush it in, and then with the black brush, I'm bringing the background back right up to that edge. Same thing here, brush that edge right in, and then smooth it back. And you can really finesse this back and forth and get quite a good effect. So there, brush it in, brush it out. So even though the handle wasn't quite in focus in the last layer, because we put that layer in, it makes it a lot easier to blend these edges. Because, you know, if we're compromising between two layers, it's better to compromise with a layer where this handle is almost in focus rather than when the handle is completely out of focus. And this is why, you know, in this case, our masked layers are going to be overlapping. If you just use hard selections, you'll find that you'll get all sorts of strange halos in your image and other kinds of blurry artifacts for that matter, because when you move focus, even in the best case scenario with a lens that shows very little change in size, there's always some, and a big jump in focus, you will just not get a good alignment. Hitting backslash here, I can see that while I've done a pretty good job around the edges of this teapot, missed all sorts of blotchy areas in the middle. And if I zoom in on that, if I turn off the backslash, you can see all those little blurry zones. And that's no problem because we're still going with it, and that's what the tool is for. So using the white brush, I can very casually take this stuff out. Now the next thing to notice about this layer is that I've been really careful here, but down here I'm just brushing way over the edge because we're actually in the same plane of focus now. So the surface of the table here is actually focused to the same place as the teapot. The next thing you'll notice is that below this plane of focus, I've just brushed everything in. And that's fine because I'm working on top of it. And in fact, it will help me mitigate differences in, again, the image changing size and focus. So I've taken this object in, I've brushed all the way forward, and I've brushed over the edges of this guy here. And as I mentioned before, as you brush forward, the things that aren't really in focus, you'll notice that they get a little bit smaller even if they're not coming into full focus, and that's really going to help us as we blend forward. So now, speeding up again, we're going to get to work. Here we've brushed the image together, and you can see that where the distances are relatively minor, everything's come together very smoothly and with great ease. And while we don't have any artifacts as bad as these big lumps around here and here as we get with the auto blending, we do still have some issues of softness around here. And right now I will show just a way to troubleshoot this problem. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. So the reason for these halos around this lion statue in the foreground are due to the fact that the lion is bigger out of focus than when it is in focus. So we can never get a perfect view of the wall behind it because the wall behind it is obscured by a slightly larger version of this subject. So we're going to go through two, I'm going to call them cheats, to solve this problem. For the first cheat, what we will do is we will go ahead and duplicate this layer that has the lion. And select the mask. I'm going to look at it with the Option key, and I'm going to select all and delete that mask. This image isn't the whole line. The tail does go a little out of focus back there. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this one too. Select everything and clear that mask. So we have two white masks. And now on this lion, I'm going to go ahead with the brush tool again And this time I'm going to kind of stack backwards. I'm going to brush out the foreground. And the reason the order of operations can be reversed here is because I'm just dealing with 2 layers. See, the foot is a little sharper on that back one too. And I don't care about halos right now because we're going to select this out anyway. I just want to make sure the whole lion is sharp. So now that that whole line is sharp, for speed, I'm just going to merge those 2 together. And now I'm going to just go ahead and make a very careful selection of this line. Now that I have selected the line here, I will simply click the mask button and we have masked out the lion. So even though we have this really clean line around it, you can see the lion has the same halo because, as I mentioned before, it is smaller than the object behind it. So here we have a variety of cheats that we can play with. One cheat we could do is we could create a new blank layer right underneath the lion, and then use the stamp tool, set to not current layer, not all layers, but current and below. And then with the stamp tool, we can just kind of go around and fake all this blurry stuff. So put a little in here. Fake out the blurry stuff or fake in the sharp stuff. So I can just put a little in there. Now I should say, of course, that, this, if you were focus stacking for any sort of analytical purpose, like if you were using this was a subject in a report or something, this method of repairing the image is totally unethical because you're creating new information. Like maybe you accidentally put another little piece of whatever this is on the brick, and that actually changes what the image means. Or, with a microscope sample, you could accidentally think you discovered a new cell or something because of replicating a little feature. But if we're just doing this to make something that looks good, we can get away with a little poetic license. Okay, this is working pretty well. To remove some of this soft material. But if you don't want to introduce new material into the picture, so I'm going to turn that layer off, another trick you can use is you can select the Move tool. So here we have the lion, and we can simply enlarge it a little bit. I'll turn off snap. We can place it exactly. And now the edge around the lion is totally clean. We might see some issues down here because I haven't done anything to fine-tune the selection, but I can always double-click on the mask and smooth the selection or feather the selection a little bit, maybe shift it out. If you do too much of that stuff, we kind of end up where we started. But just kind of get messing around with these tools, which we go over more in the selection exercise. We can kind of fine-tune this guy so he blends right back into his surroundings. So from an ethical point of view, I suppose the best thing to do is to just keep the artifacts. I think that while in this case we have manipulated the picture a little bit, we've taken an object and enlarged it, it's kind of an ethical gray area in terms of whether this is still a true image. I think that yes, we've enlarged it a little bit, but this is focus stacking, and we've only enlarged it to the size that the object was when the camera was focused on the back. So, the object is still in the same place. We haven't introduced any new information. We've just enlarged the object to cover blurry information. So to me, I think this is a pretty elegant solution. You can see, if we look at our layers individually. They just kind of slowly progress the image into focus. Now, if you find this method a little too pokey, and by that I mean you have to do a little too much targeted handiwork, or if you don't like using the brush tool, the next video will be a method for focus stacking through transparent objects like glass objects, and that technique is completely different and does not use brushes at all. And if you're wondering, does that technique work on an image like this without transparency, we will find out.